Hi, good afternoon to all of you that have joined us who are based in Europe and the rest of the world. And good morning. Have I said good morning? I've said it all wrong, haven't I? Let me start again. Oh my God, how many times have I done this? So, good morning to all of you that have joined us from the States and Canada, and good afternoon to everyone else that has joined us. So, thank you for joining us. We have our Future of Work with Rick Hammell, our monthly edition on our LinkedIn Live. So we really like our sessions to be as interactive as possible. So if you sort of see me looking at my mobile, I have to reply and, the technology is not that great, but we're nearly there. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comment box. And also, it'd be great to see where all of you are from. Geeky thing that I like to see where everyone joins us from around the world, basically, so I can be a bit jealous as well. So Rick has joined us from the States. So Rick, do you want to introduce yourself to those of you that don't, to those of the audience that don't know you?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. So, Rick Hammell, I'm a founder. I've been a CEO. I have worked in HR for many years. I actually am an practitioner. I am very focused on how HR can revolutionize how businesses operate. And so, coming from the HR world and being a CEO and now being an investor, it's really important that we talk about these topics and see how we can actually look at changing the dynamic and bringing HR to the table. So, I'm super excited to be at this call. Thank you, Melanie, for again having me this month.
So I'm excited about this topic because, employer of record, I feel like we talk about it a lot within, just daily meetings I'm having, and especially with those of the audience and clients and members who are looking to expand into other countries, and those companies that are already in location thinking as an employer of record, is that actually an option? So to start off with, Rick, do you want to explain what an employer of record is? I think that's the best place to start.
Yeah, so an employer of record, in essence, is a organization that acts as the legal employer for you in a country where you don't have a legal entity. What's important to understand that is that they take on the full responsibility of the act of an employment, from an employment contract, benefits, tax management, and payroll requirements. What's really important to understand behind that as well is that the employer of record is the legal employer, but the client is what we call the managing employer. So the one that actually creates right of direction, work for the employee, assignments, but they partner with the employer of record to ensure that they're fully compliant in a country where they don't actually have a legal establishment. What's a little bit different, and I always like to dive in and explain what the difference between global PEO and employer of record, because that's another term that's quite used in this industry. A global PEO, which I don't actually believe is the term that we should use, the definition of a PEO is where two legal employers employ an employee in a given country. And outside of the US, that's not actually legal. So, what's important when you partner with an employer of record, that employer of record only partner with you where you don't have establishment in that country, because that can create a bigger issue for you in the future from a compliance perspective. But the employer of record is the legal employer in that country, operating in a country where you do not have a legal establishment at this moment.
Okay, so another big keyword I think we discuss is compliance. We discuss compliance all the time. So how does compliance work with local legislation, with an EOR and payroll? What are the key differences with that?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty similar in regards to how it's operated. So as the legal employer, an employer of record actually is responsible for payroll management, reporting taxes, similar to you would work with a local payroll provider. So if you are working in technology, you're submitting your payroll, you're submitting your changes. That EOR provider will actually take that information from you and actually process it accordingly. The difference with traditional payroll, though, is that you own that responsibility and you just have an organization processing that payroll, those calculations for you, and in some cases, making the funding to those employees for direct deposits on your behalf. But the employer of record on your behalf actually manages that full administration part in the back end. So when you look at the pros and cons between both organizations, a traditional payroll and an employer of record model, the employer of record model kind of takes that administrative burden from you, and it really works for companies who have less than like 15 employees in a given country, because that's a huge administrative burden just for a couple of employees. But when you look at a particular scale, when you're over 15, 15 to 20 is really the hot spot that you typically find. That's when companies will start looking at offboarding from an employer of record and looking at traditional payroll because they have the ability to really manage from a scale perspective. 15 to 20 employees, it just makes more sense to have your own entities and your own establishment at that particular moment.
So I was on having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they are in a situation where they're being encouraged to put all of their employees through an employer of record, and it's a global organization with a high volume employee. Do you think that that's an expensive option as an employer of record, or is it just better managed through a global payroll solution?
Yeah, it really depends on what kind of the scale. So I've seen organizations who've had hundreds of employees, but their volumes in a particular country were very small. So it made sense to partner with an employer of record from that perspective. One thing that an employer of record can actually do and really support from that type of organization, if they have less than 10, 15, 20 employees, less than that number of employees, there's bigger scale out there for benefits, administration. Um, Organizations can compete and find talent because they can leverage the employer of record to help find that talent with the benefits they have in place. But if an organization has a high volume of employees in a given country, I think you have to look at what works best for your organization. Are you there for a temporary basis? There are a lot of like government contracts that are there only for a year or two, so establishing an entity at that particular moment doesn't make any sense. But realistically, when you get to a certain volume, I think it's important to look at that, and also look at how you want to develop that employee experience when you look at an employer, kind of like the overall operation in that particular country. So to answer your question, it really depends on kind of your scale. You can have hundreds of employees, but over 150 countries, or you can have 150 employees in one country, and at that point, it doesn't make sense to have an employer of record. It makes more sense to have your own establishment at that point. Again, it just depends on the volume and what's your long-term strategy in that particular country.
And you can process the benefits through an employer of record, can you?
Yeah, well, because the employer of record is the legal employer, I think the one thing that's really important is that employer of record can give you scale. So that company that's starting to hire that one employee, I'll give an example of Spain.
Yeah.
Hire that first employee in Spain, the benefits for one employee for one employer is not going to be very cost effective. It's going to be very high because when a benefits provider underwrites you, they're looking at your overall risk. And one employee in one country, that's a lot of risk from their perspective. So if you leverage an employer of record who has hundreds of employees in that country, you're getting the discount of that volume, which is why when you get back to volume in a particular country, then you have the buying power that you can to establish your own entities. So we typically find the life cycle with employers when they get to a certain scale, then they'll say, I can actually afford this. This is we're getting the discounts from this perspective, and we want to create a better experience or a different experience for the employees that we actually can own and operate. And so that's when it makes sense. But smaller scales in a given country, you can leverage better buying power, better benefits, and being more competitive as an employer, partnering with that employer.
Yeah. So as I said, if anybody's got any questions, please feel free to add them in the comment box. I see we have one person here from Paris, so lovely to see you. Again, if you want to tell us where you're from, it'd be great to see. So obviously we've mentioned compliance. What about regulations? Change all the time, don't they? Like every single country. So who's within the employer of record, who is responsible for keeping up to date with that, and again on the payroll provider?
Yeah, I think when you're looking, I think from a regulatory perspective, I think it's important and it's best practice that every business has some type of due diligence and how they're operating. So if they're partnering with a local payroll provider, typically your local payroll provider will support you in helping you stay compliant. But if you read the fine print of their contracts, they say that it's your responsibility. So I always think it's really important that you look at that and understand on that. And sometimes that's just partnering with the right law firm. Doesn't mean you have to call them all the time when you're using payroll, but it's having the right support to double check what's being presented to you from that perspective. because what you typically find both from the employer of record side and a local payroll provider, it's their excuse me, it's their interpretation of the law. So it's always important to get something that's going to be based on your organization's kind of feedback. But the difference with the employer of record model, though, is that the employer of record model, there's a invested interest that it has to be done right. So there is a component that if it's wrong, if the employer of record tells you something and it's incorrect for any reason, they are the legal employer from that perspective. And because they're the legal employer, they're the actual ones that are ultimately responsible for whatever actions taken. So you do get a little bit more protection under the employer of record model because of that, because they are vested. Now, I'm going to caveat that by saying it's when you're partnering with an employer of record model that's direct. Because a direct model means they own and operate the entities that they're supporting, they become the legal employer. When an employer of record outsources to a third party, they're actually the ones that are not necessarily responsible for the actual legality of the employee. It's the actual legal employer that they're using or they're leveraging in that particular country. So it's really important when you're looking at that, depending, again, if you're just going into a particular country, or even if you're at a particular scale and you want to know how to offboard, it's really important to really know who you're partnering with and who actually ultimately has the responsibility and legality for the experience of the employee. And that direct employer of record model can actually be a little bit more advantageous because they have legal responsibility as well. From a payroll perspective, the experience is it's pretty much the same and consistent with local payroll providers. They'll make sure that you do it right because they want to make sure they're growing their business. So they want to make sure from word of mouth that they're supporting you guys. But it's also ultimately your responsibility as you're the legal employer from that perspective. So the decisions, they'll give you options, but you have to decide how you're going to actually operate in that particular country within the bounds of that particular rules and regulations.
So it's really important then to do your due diligence right at the beginning to really understand the model that the employer of record has.
Yeah, I think, the thing is, and I will say also with payroll as well, if global expansion was easy, we wouldn't be here today, right? The thing is that every country is a little bit different. Every country has different regulations, and they're also starting to become a little bit more heavily regulated. The employer of record model, many countries, specifically in Europe, are starting to be license required. They're looking to make sure that they're weeding out the bad players. I'm going to put that in quotation marks, and making sure that they have the right people who are following due diligence, and the governments can actually review and make sure that they're doing things the right way. Employer of record model. I mean, I coined the term employer of record because I saw the need and the description that we have to say what we offer. We are the legal employer from that perspective. But what's important is that there are sometimes bad players out there. So doing that due diligence, really understanding how to do business. It's a new market, so making sure that you're asking the right questions, seeing what licensing they have, what certifications they have, how long have they been in business, if they're direct or indirect, and find out how they actually operate. And then, definitely getting references from clients. And I always say, ask for references that had a good experience and a client that had a bad experience that you were able to turn around. Because it's not, payroll's not easy. Sometimes you can process 1,000 pay slips, but if you get one wrong, you're bad. So you have to be able to do some due diligence from that perspective and say, hey, how did you resolve this problem? Because employment laws change, experiences change. That employer of record or even that local payroll provider can really help with some of that overall experience for the employee as well.
Yeah, and I think all of those payroll professionals knows what happens when one person does something. When one pay slip is wrong, everyone in the team knows about it. But we have a question here. Don't EORs often make use of small local providers? Who has the risk here? Thanks, Ralph.
Ralph, that's a great question. So when I coined the term direct employer of record, when I invested in an organization, I started my organization partly because of my own experience. I was a head of HR for a government contractor, and we were operating in Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Japan. And I had used what they called at the time a global PEO, and they mucked it up. They worked with third party partners. Employees weren't getting paid on time because they didn't own that. So when I left that organization and started the employer of record that I had started about 10 years ago, we went direct. We did not want to use local providers because that indirect model sometimes creates a lot of angst There's some pros and cons with it, meaning there's some expertise that's there, but working with an employer of record that actually has a direct model is really important for success. And the reason why I say that is because of that risk that you're asking about. If that direct employer doesn't pay an employee, if that direct employer makes a mistake in that particular country, they have a vested interest to make sure it's done correctly. And if they don't do it correctly, they are the legal employer, so they have a legal liability that comes with that. Those who use local providers, and there are quite a few, that's why they call it the indirect model, because it gives them scale and leverage in countries where they don't have entities. There's a risk because you don't have a contract with that local provider. And because you don't have a contract with that local provider, you're not the customer. And same with the same experience I had before I started my organization, it was very much focused on the employee experience. I would call and say, "Is someone getting paid on time?" And the word I learned at that time was inshallah. I know, Melanie, you know the story, which means God willing, which is not the experience I wanted. So that there's a risk using an indirect provider if they don't really have a contract with you and they don't really share that liability with you from that perspective.
Thank you, Rick. We've got another question here. I think we sort of covered it, but let's go through it again. Does the PEO model only exist in the US or in other regions of the world as well? Which ones? We can't find this model in Europe.
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, we answered it early, but I'm happy to come back to it. PEO, by definition, is where two legal employers employ one employee as a in a given country. Um, PEO, by definition, is not legal in Europe. The reason why we use the term employer of record is because the employer of record has a sole, they're the sole employer in the eyes of the government. There's no co-employment from that perspective. And so you have to really understand the definition between PEO, which is very much a US term and highly regulated in the US and regulated by 50 different states, different ways, versus what you see in the EOR model, which is we are the legal employer. So for any reason something happens, it's not co-employment. Now there are master service agreements, SOWs that kind of help mitigate that and push some of that liability back to the client. But in the eyes of the government, if for any reason an employee is not paid, it is the responsibility of the employer of record to make sure that they're paid. Taxes aren't paid, it falls on the employer of record. It doesn't fall on the client. Now, again, through contracts, we would say that you have to make sure you pay the employer of record, make sure that you pay those taxes to us so we can remit that. But there is a component of liability that only sits with the employer of record in a country outside of the US versus a PEO model. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And our next question is, if the EOR is the hiring company, does it mean the pay slips are calculated under the EOR entity, not under the client name, a company who the employees are in fact working for?
That is correct. So as the legal employer, their employment agreement, their pay slip will show ABC company as the legal employer. There's no, you can't really co-brand it. You're not really supposed to co-brand it. It actually does create liability for the client in that particular country. But I will say that it's you don't really see a lot of issues with that with employees because of the right of direction. The person that's the employee's working with on a day-to-day basis is the client in question. But just like the direct deposit, their pay slip, their employment agreement, it will indicate that they are working for the employer of record in the legal name of that employer of record in the country. That is correct.
So we're talking about the employees then. So what happens when there is a dispute? Who deals with that side? Who's sort of, does it go onto the EOR or the employer?
A good employer of record will partner with the client through that, and I think it's a partnership from that perspective because the client has the right of direction and we're working with the actual employee on a day-to-day basis. It's important that the client leverages the EOR as much as they can to really understand the rules and regulations of that country and understand their options of what they need to do to either mitigate that risk or take the next steps to make sure that it's fully compliant and whatever actions that need to be taken. So there is a component of that they must partner with the employer of record. It's really important that open communication is there as well. You never want to surprise an employer of record of something that may be brewing and within an organization. So I always like to when I speak with my clients, I always come back and say, hey, think of us as your extension of your HR department. How can we make sure we're supporting you in these countries to make sure that we either it's communication or consulting on how we can make sure that you're doing things the right way in a given country. It's really important from that partnership perspective of how you partner with the employer of record. And by the way, that same thing goes on the payroll side of it. How you terminate an employee, how you onboard an employee, or how you terminate an employee in a country really also determines how you also have to pay them. And so making sure that you are communicating as much as possible, as transparent as possible, what's going on, it only allow you to be set up for success in a given country.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you wasn't using an employer of record, I'd feel that obviously you've got to deal with everything in house, haven't you? Or provide find a solution where the employer of record is almost like the support to tell you what you should be doing in those different countries.
That is correct. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that there's also things that you need to understand from the employer of record, is that scale that the employer of record is in that particular country, there are certain rules and regulations that you have to stay with, comply with. So as you get to certain sizes in certain countries, you now become applicable for certain laws that come up, and because a typical employer of record would have scale, they're already applicable for that. So you may have one or two employees in a country, but you're still going to be subject to laws that are over 50 employees. And which is really good because it sets an expectation up front. So when you're scaling in that country, that you already set that standard. But to understand, and this is where I think some of the confusion comes with some with clients and prospects, they'll go, I only have two employees. Why do I have to offer this particular benefit to employees? Well, because you're partnering with an employer of record. So there's that pros and cons that we talked about earlier. If you have traditional payroll, and you only have two employees, you may not be subject to certain rules and regulations in a country. But when you partner with an employer of record, they're already at that scale. So although you get the benefits of a large organization, you also have the rules and regulations that you have to comply with as well as from a large organization perspective.
I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. That's really, really interesting. So, with regards to you managing the workforce, then, what is almost like the better solution when you're dealing with hiring or layoffs?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So really depends on scale. Every country has a cap. When you get to a certain number of layoffs in a particular country, you have to go through a notification process. You have to go through, in some cases, a labor board. It really depends on their CBA, their collective bargaining agreement in a particular country as well, and you have to follow those steps. With an employer of record, the same as that subject of being a larger organization, you have better scale because it's based on sometimes in some countries it's based on a percentage of employees. So even if you're doing a larger cut of employees, it's actually from an employer record perspective, a percentage of their larger number of employees in that particular country. So on the flip side of that, when you're at a smaller scale, that means if you're cutting 50% of your workforce at a certain scale, that you have to make notifications. So if you're at 20 employees and you're cutting 10 people, you may have to make a notification where if you're cutting 10 people with an employer of record, you won't have to do that. So it really it depends on the country and the rules and regulations and your size. There are benefits from that. Now, on the flip side of that is if the employer of record doesn't have enough employees in that country, then you're still subject to those rules as well. So your layoffs could ultimately affect their overall book of business. And so there is a pros and cons behind that. And the employer of record would have to partner with you, and typically their in-house or outside counsel to ensure how they navigate that offboarding from that perspective. So there's a risk slightly with that as well. And hopefully we don't do enough layoffs, but hopefully the economy is getting better.
Well, so yeah, so do I. I feel like a few months ago, I think it was a bit doom and gloom, wasn't it? But I'm hoping that we're getting a bit more positivity. And we've got our budget tomorrow, so let's see what happens in the UK. So if you're working in locations, I think we sort of covered this, but does one option support managing a diverse workforce better than the other between the payroll and the BOR?
Well, let's elaborate on diverse workforce, though, because the employer of record does not source talent for the client. Um, there are some that say they offer staffing services. You have to be very careful with that because employer of record and staffing is a very thin line between the two. And staffing is heavily regulated. Now, I'll use Europe as an example. Staffing is heavily regulated in Europe. And there's also a different type of licensing requirement from that perspective. And so there are some employer of records that'll say, we'll do staffing and then we'll do employer of record. And actually, if you put those two together, that looks like temp services. And sometimes they're not fully compliant from how they're actually operating in a particular country because they're offering both services. And in my past, in my investment companies that I've had, particularly for EOR, we chose not to do staffing because of that kind of that thin line behind that. So that was a component that we were very careful about. But when you talk about diversity and looking for managing a diverse workforce, that really depends on your organization. You have to look at your DEI initiatives. You've got to look at how you're going to onboard and source talent. The employer of record can give you statistics, which I think is really important. One of the things that I learned as a CEO of my last organization was that diversity, we typically look at DEI or diversity based on our own local biases. So I looked at DEI a lot from my American bias, but had a really interesting conversation with one of my employees in the past where I went down to Brazil, and that employee said, you preach diversity, you say that you're a diverse organization, but if you look at our talent, Brazil's population is 56% of African descent. And our population we had 2 people out of 50 in Brazil that were of African descent. So we definitely were not meeting the diversity expectations of Brazil. But for me, as an American, I was going, wait, they're Latino, they're in Latin America, checkbox, we hit our diversity quota here. In actuality, diversity is so localized, which is why I use the term localization. It's so localized. So when you look at that, you can partner with an employer of record to really help you learn those cultural nuances or those nuances in those particular countries that help you really expand your DEI initiatives and how to do business in those countries if that's really important to your organization, which I think it should be.
I think that's one thing I've noticed traveling even this year is that you assume certain things, but you've got to almost like stop doing that because every country is different. Every country has, a different way to how I would be. And it's being aware of that, isn't it? It's, that's one of the biggest things. Don't ever assume. Actually, I should have learned that a long time ago. But anyway, if you have any questions, please keep firing them over because it's really interesting to see what you guys are thinking about. I did mention the benefits. Who administers and manages the benefits packages if this is on an employer of record? So would this be an employer of record deals with that, or would that again be with the employer?
Yeah, so employer of record, and again, this gets back to that direct versus indirect model. A direct model, they own and operate their countries. They are the legal employer, so they can go to market and build a benefits package on your behalf and build that for their overall employees in that particular country. So the employer of record actually should manage that for you. They should be able to give you a number of options. In my past, we had both global plans and local plans that we were able to offer to our customers at that particular moment. And in some cases where we were able to customize, we were able to do some of that in support of our clients to see what, within a parameter, what we can also offer to elevate those particular benefits. And if we felt that there was a benefit that could benefit all of our clients, we would then actually elevate that and then go to all of our clients and say, here's a benefit for you as well. Would you like to enroll into this? So the employer of record should manage that overall benefit administration. Under the the traditional payroll component, there are brokerage firms out there. I will say that I've seen some really amazing solutions where organizations can create like a benefit marketplace where employees they can offer benefits. They can figure out a budget for their employees in that particular country, and then the employees can go out and find the benefits within that budget that works for them and their families. So there's an opportunity to leverage, even with traditional payroll, a benefit marketplace, and there's quite a few good ones and a number of ones that are popping up now. Not so much in the US, it's a little bit different, but outside of the US, you're seeing some really, really amazing kind of benefit solutions tied to, fully compliant and tied to local regulations that people that have their own entities and traditional payroll setup, they can leverage from that. Now, one thing, Melanie, I want to add to that, I think it's really important, is that as you get to scale with an employer of record and you decide to offboard them, there's a thing called TUPE. And it's really important in Europe when you transition from an employer of record to your own entities, you still have to make sure that the employee gets equal or if not better benefits when you transfer. An employee cannot lose their benefits because they're transferring between the employers. And so in reviewing that, that employer of record can help you with that transition to make sure wherever they were at and how they, whatever you're looking to put in place, that you're fully compliant from that perspective as well.
So I think this is pretty a hot topic at the moment. So regarding data security and privacy, where do we stand with the payroll option and the employer of record?
Well, I think all options, so traditional payroll, employer of record, both organizations, if you're using a local payroll provider, we all have our GDPR, our data privacy rules and regulations that we have to comply with. From a system perspective, from a data perspective, we still have to have employees know that we have their data. We employees need to have knowledge of that data. Employees still have the right to be forgotten from that perspective as well. And so those data points, everyone's responsible from that. Now, who has more responsibility? So, from an employer of record perspective, one thing that's important that I think is that employer of record should do is there should be a checkbox for employer records where they say, "Hey, you need the employees to give us approval to share this information with the client." I know that sounds a little weird, but because the employer of record is the legal employer and the client's a third party, technically from a contractual perspective, the employee has to give rights to share that information. Once that employee gives that right to share that information with the client, the three parties have a responsibility. The employee has to make sure that they know where their data is at. The employer of record has to make sure they're maintaining it and fully compliant from that perspective. And if the if the employer of record is using a local payroll provider or using a third-party technology, there needs to be a sign-off from that perspective as well. And then the client has to make sure that they're fully compliant and understand the rules and regulations from that perspective. For traditional payroll, it's almost the same thing in regards to who's processing, where the information's at. But because with GDPR, an employer can share your information as long as it allows them to do their job to make sure that they're, as the employer, so make sure you get paid, to make sure you're paying benefits, things like that. As long as you're made aware of that, they can do that. But they still, isn't the local provider has an obligation to make sure that they're fully compliant in those with the rules and regulations as well.
So with the employer of record, how does it work with like the ongoing engagement? Who does the employer speak to?
The employee or the employer?
Sorry, the employee. So many, yeah, the employee. Thanks, Rick.
So the employee typically works with the client on a day-to-day basis. If they come to the employer of record, it's typically for something simple like, "Hey, where's my pay slip?" Or "Hey, I had a quick question on my payroll." But typically, we suggest that the employee and the client actually engage because we think that communication is right there. The client's the one that's submitting the payroll information to us. The client's the one that's just determining salary, benefits, any allowances that are all up to the employee. So that communication is really important from that perspective. But we do have an open, and we encourage as well that the employee, if they have questions, they can reach out to the employer of record. You want to have an employer worker that's open to that engagement as well and be able to be responsive because typically the client's in a different country and in many cases a different time zone. And so employees want to be able to have a good employee experience. Where if it's a simple question like, "Hey, I just need an authorization showing that I work for you guys. I'm getting a mortgage. I need to show proof of employment." Those things can easily go to the employer of record, and the employer of record can produce that on behalf of the employee in their time zone because a direct employer of record would actually have presence in that market for them. So I think it's important just to kind of set that expectation up with the employee and the client, and you can decide, and it can be on a client by client basis, but what's the best way to communicate? But the best way is day-to-day operations goes to the client, administrative, similar to an HR department, administrative things will come to the employer of record.
So I think we've come across this with some of our members on the traditional payroll side. So what is the process for ending the relationship with each option and what happens to the employee records and data?
Yeah, so it's a pretty simple process actually. So we'll start with traditional payroll. The client actually owns that. It's based on the contract. Typically, they'll give notice within that contract, and they would offboard. I think what's important with traditional payroll, though, you're going to want to have historical data sent over to you. You're going to want, if you're going to mid-year transfer, whoever you're transferring to, they're going to want to have, if it's monthly or quarterly, details for that transfer so they can make sure that your taxes are calculated correctly going forward if it's a mid-year transfer for traditional payroll. And then you can have all that information sent over to you. You should with a local payroll provider, if it's a monthly filing or quarterly filing, you should have tax returns that are sent to you from that perspective that you should have access to. If you don't, you should be asking for that information before you transfer so that you have a record of that just in case something does come up in the future. And again, depending on your contract, you would give notice and then offboard accordingly. With an employer of record, same thing, there's a contract obligation as well, but there's one tricky component to that as well, is that not only are you terminating the contract with the employer of record, but the employer of record then has to turn the contract of the employee as well. And so we have to make sure that although your contract may say with the employer of record, you can terminate within 90 days, you still have to look at your actual terms and conditions of the employment agreement, because the employment agreement always will supersede the notice requirement of the employer of record. So if for any reason you have an executive on the employer of record and you have a 6-month notice period, you have to understand that there's two things that can happen. You can have them terminate the executive from that perspective, and they would have to pay out the notice requirement. So if it's a 6-month notice requirement, they would have to pay that out to the executive at that point. And then you can terminate within the termination notice of your actual employment, of your master service agreement. Or you would look at the notice period and say, okay, we're going to make notice, we're going to give a notice of 6 months, and then they can start that termination process and fully compliant. It wouldn't cost you an additional thing. So you just look at the employment agreements and look at the your master service agreement and determine what's the best way and best course of action from that. And you always want to be proactive in how you terminate with an employer of record, because I think sometimes we always want to, I'll wait to the last minute to terminate with my provider, but the employer of record is so tied to the employee experience. So partnering with them and letting them know, hey, we're going to offboard here, but this is what we're thinking. Let them give you feedback behind that as well, so that you can make sure it's a smooth transition from that perspective. And in some cases, you're able to transfer employment through what they call a TTA, a trilateral transfer agreement, where you can transfer that employment either to another employer of record, or you're able to transfer that to your own local entities. It's a little complicated in certain countries, but there are some countries that will allow that. And so you should always ask about a TTA, a trilateral transfer agreement, and see if it's applicable in the country that you're operating with the employer of record.
So I've come across more and more people looking to use an employer record. Is there any advice that you would give people when setting up a service level agreement?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. Notice periods are really important to maybe understand that. So asking a lot of questions on that. When you're looking at hiring executives or mid-management in these particular roles, what does that mean for you? Asking to see a copy of depending on the country, if there's a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, because in some cases there's some rules and regulations that you need to understand from that perspective. Another thing as well is that an employer of record, and really understanding this, sometimes a master service agreement with an employer of record seems one-sided. And in some cases, it's going to be, because the employer of record, especially if they're direct, are taking on majority of the liability. If for any reason that a client doesn't pay an employer of record, there's a risk that the employer of record still has to pay the employee. And so there's a lot of terms and conditions in the agreement that kind of supersedes that and says, look, for any reason we still have to pay the employee, you're still on the hook for this. And that seems a little harsh in the MSA, but there's a reason because of that liability. They are taking on that risk. So understanding kind of where it sits and what the employer record is taking on and how they're supporting your organization is really important when they're kind of reviewing that MSA and understanding kind of the reason why it may seem a little one-sided. But in some cases, most of the employer records are willing to negotiate certain things within their MSA, but understanding kind of the basis, what's your role and what's their role, and how it's outlined in the contract is really important.
So you mentioned that in some of the countries, they're trying to put regulations in for employer of record. So I've come across a few employers that are looking to use an employer of record, but they've been encouraged to move their employees over into contractors. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on that, Rick? Actually,
Yeah,
your face said a lot then.
yeah,
What's your thoughts on that?
yeah. I'm a little concerned when I hear someone says that they recommend moving an employee, and I'm emphasizing employee to a contractor basis, because an employee, um, there's certain, there's definitions of what an employee is in a particular country. An employer of record's there to help mitigate that. If you don't have a legal establishment in that particular country, leveraging an employer of record does really help mitigate that risk on your behalf. A contractor is where someone is really determining their own work schedules. They're determining they're not on company email and things like that. You could run, it sounds fun and dandy when everything's working and everyone's paying. But you have to remember, I had a situation with a client actually I was just speaking to the other day, who's asking about, I'm doing some consulting work for them, and they came to me and said, "Look, I want to pay this employee as an employee because I just had another employee tell us that they're going to possibly sue us in this particular country because they are not getting maternity benefits as a contractor." So this particular person they're using as a contractor, they've used a contractor for maybe 2 years in a European country, and now because they're not going to be working, they're saying, "Well, I should get maternity benefits because they just had a baby." Well, they said, "Well, you're a contractor. We don't have an obligation to do that, and we've given you free reign behind that." But that particular contractor came back and said, "Well, I've been working under your direction. I've been acting like an employee, and I should be paid and that benefit like an employee." So there's a risk. It's never when it's fine and dandy. It's when there's dispute that comes up where that can create even bigger risk for that employer. And I had recommended that they go ahead and pay out maternity, and then they look at partnering with an employer of record because it created bigger risk for their organization. And when employees file claims like that, countries tend to look back over 3 years. And with those situations, I've heard this happen with other employer of records that we're doing contract work for versus employer of record, where the country came back and assessed a tax on the employer, both for the employee and the employer burden for 3 years retroactively, because they should have been an employee versus a contractor. So I highly recommend. There are ways you can do contractors. There's ways that compliantly can do it, but there should never be an assessment saying I'm going to convert an employee to a contractor versus leveraging something like an employer of record.
Yeah, be aware. If the EOR is not established in the country in which payroll is requested, it means that no payroll is possible. Example, I'm in France, and if I'm reached out by an employer of record in UK who has no establishment in France, but who's reached out by a French client, I therefore cannot run any payroll.
That's actually correct. So they have to have a legal presence. I did hear about an employer of record who was based in the UK who was trying to run European payroll. Sorry, they were based out of Ireland trying to run European payroll, saying that they can hire all Europeans in Ireland and pay them through Ireland. Now, could it be done? Yes. Is it compliant? No, because you have to think about the benefits. Using the example I just used from maternity leave, benefits that are the people are entitled to in countries that they are operating in. So you're in France, you're entitled to certain benefits as in this in France. And so if you're being paid out of Ireland in your payroll, your pay slip, you can work there. Technically, you're European, you have the ability, but your benefits would be tied to Ireland, not to France. And when you look at what you're entitled to, like your vacation time, your collective bargaining agreement rights, your maternity leave, paternity leave, those are things that, from a compliant perspective, you want to work with someone that has a legal establishment in a country that you're operating in or that you're working in, because you, as the employee, have those rights. And from a compliance perspective, let's say something happens, you want to make sure that your benefits are paid in France. You don't want them paid out of Ireland.
Some interesting points being raised. We're coming to towards an end, so if you do have any questions, please add them now. So how do you know which is the best option for you? Traditional payroll, employer of record?
Yeah, I think it's really based on your organization, and it also really I believe it's based on your size. What are you looking to accomplish in a particular country? What are you looking to? How are you looking to operate? If you're just dipping your toe into a new market, and you're just hiring, you found the best talent in a country that you don't operate in, an employer of record can be really beneficial for you in that particular market. When you get to a certain scale, that's when you have to decide, does this make sense for me in our organization to establish our own entities? And again, that doesn't mean on the third or fourth employee. Typically, it's between anywhere between 15 and 20, and sometimes more employees in a given country where it's time to start looking at establishment. And then it doesn't mean it has to be right away. There's a way that you can partner with that employer record to offboard those employees in a seamless way and less impactful way, and really making sure the employee experience is held intact. But traditional payroll, I will say, with my new business, I'm already setting up entities in 15 countries because I know where I'm going to be operating, and I've got staff in 15 countries already with my newest entity, my new business. But because I know that that's the best direction how I'm going to be scaling my business, I'm not leveraging an employer of record, although I own an employer of record. I'm very much focused on the strategy and how I'm operating. So it really depends on what your business is, what you're doing, and how you're looking to operate. If it's a short-term goal, if it's someone you need to hire right away, then employer of record can be really advantageous for you. If it's not something you're testing the market, an employer of record can be very advantageous for you. But if you know this is a market you're going to, that you're going to quickly grow into, then maybe establishing your own entities at that point, because you know you're going to scale pretty quickly. That's perfectly fine as well. It just really depends on what your overall strategy is and your global expansion.
So for all those payroll leaders, it's really to understand what your business is looking to do for the future, to understand what's happening, so you can advise the board in the best way to pay people, really.
Melanie, this is why HR and payroll has to sit at the table. I can't. There's a huge strategy component where payroll and HR can really help determine the best direction for the organization if it's using employer of record or setting up their own entities based on their own strategy and what's going to be the most cost effective or the best investment for the business. So understanding strategy, making sure HR and payroll sitting at the table can really set the business for success.
Yeah, my best example was when somebody rang and said, I've just been told that we've employed some people in China. Can I use my UK system? And unfortunately, she was the last person to know. I'm sure everyone else knew in the leadership team. It was her responsibility to get that up and running. So it's you're right. We need a seat at the table. So my last question, really, I'm not sure if there's an answer, or if you're happy to answer this, Rick. It's always about money. What's the difference with sort of in the cost structures for each option?
Yeah, so there's an investment on both sides, right? So when you think of traditional payroll, I always look at the bigger picture behind that. So establishing your entity, setting up bank accounts, making sure that you go after certain benefits, and then obviously looking at partnering with your local payroll provider. That will you have to look at that overall cost. And there's upfront cost investment depending on the country that you're going to. That can cost a couple $1,000s to $100,000 depending on the country that you're going into. There are bank establishments, and depending on your size and what your volume of turnover that you're going to have in the bank, depends on what kind of bank's going to work with you in that particular country as well. And then time. Time is always money as well. How long does it take to set up a particular country around the world? Now, post-COVID, countries have figured out to do it faster because they want people to continue to do business in them. So it's not as long as it used to be, but it still takes time, and sometimes it requires travel. So all of that you got to think about. It can cost a lot of money to get that set up, but it's upfront investment. It's not a long-term investment. It's not a long-term cost, if that makes sense. An employer of record, though, it's a short-term. The short-term investment upfront to get set up is actually pretty cost-effective. So it gets you in pretty quickly. You can onboard within a matter of days with an employer of record, so you can get going. So using that example of hiring someone in a country that they just found out about in China, you can onboard an employee in China with an employer of record in a matter of days, compliantly, versus having to do the establishment from that perspective. But the cost per employee is a little bit higher than what you would typically see for a pay slip for payroll. So it really depends on if the upfront cost, which is going to be a better long-term goal, or if it's a higher cost but on a monthly basis and a recurring basis of where you're looking to set up. So there's pros and cons behind that, and that really gets to volume. So getting back to that 15 to 20, that employer of record costs can be a little bit more exorbitant from that perspective versus traditional payroll. But again, with traditional payroll, you're doing a bigger investment up front, depending on the country that you're operating in.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rick. Again, so much information to take in. I think on the employer of record, I feel like we need to have like a fact sheet of things that you just need to ask. Just like a little checklist of different things, because it is such a huge industry now, and there are so many new players coming into market, and some things that it's okay to do, and maybe some that aren't. So maybe that's something we should have a think of in the future, is to have some sort of guides of a checklist that we can put out. But before we go, is there anything that you want to add, Rick?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm really big about being transparent on employer of record and global payroll. Transparently, I own an employer of record, and I have other companies that I've actually invested in, and I've got a new one that's going to be launching soon. That's going to be really supporting a lot of this work as well. So, if anyone has any questions, they can reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. I tend to answer every message that I get on LinkedIn. Not right away, typically within 24 to 48 hours, but feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a call with you guys to help answer this. And as you're navigating employer of records, there's a handful of them out there that are good. There are a handful of them out there that are not so good. I'm happy to give you an unbiased view on that, because it's really important that, my Achilles heel is helping people. And I want to make sure that people are partnered with the right organizations to really support them from that perspective. And who knows, there may be something that may be the true future of work coming up soon, that you'll learn about in 2024 from me. So it was a pleasure, Melanie. Thank you so much. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to answer those questions.
So I know we've got our next session at the beginning of December, so we'll advertise that shortly. So I hope everyone can make that session. And as Rick said, get in contact with him on LinkedIn. If you've got any questions for myself, feel free to contact me. But we'll see you all hopefully next month. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.